Okay, and we are a go. Hello, this is Maximus Confesses here, and I'm going to start with another one of my awesome dialogues. Today, the topic is about pro-life apologetics, for those of you who might be unaware. Pro-life apologetics details defending the case against abortion from, particularly as it applies to Christian apologetics, a Christian point of view. With that being said, I have a friend of mine, Cody Nelson, who favors and has looked upon this topic. I trust his abilities on this subject matter, and I'm going to ask him a few personal questions, and I'm also going to ask him about the general topic at hand. Good to have you, Cody.
Good to be here.
So, Cody, would you mind detailing how you became interested in the pro-life, pro-choice debate, especially as a Christian?
A lot of my, earlier part of my life, junior high school, wasn't really something I thought much about. In high school, especially, I had the idea. My view sort of was, yeah, well, I guess I think it's immoral, but I don't think it should be legal, kind of view. And then, actually, I think what started is I actually read a book called Legislating Morality by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek, and there's a chapter in the book. The whole book wasn't about abortion, but there was a chapter in it that was, and it just made me. I just read it, and it was just like, oh man, I realized I really hadn't thought about the issue as much as I should have here. And then from there, I kind of got a little bit more interested in it. And then as I looked at the pro-life arguments, I kind of realized, wow, yeah, this is some good stuff here. Like I didn't realize it, and so it kind of snowballed from there that I just became more interested in the subject. And because it's like, wow, like, if this is right, then abortion is a serious crime here because it's killing a baby basically. And so yeah, that's sort of how I got into the whole thing. And
Oh, that strikes me as being very interesting. So it started off with Geisler and Turek, but did it lead you into reading anything based on the arguments of non-apologetical figures, perhaps moral philosophers?
Oh, yeah, actually. Well, okay, I guess, well, Francis Beckwith, who I guess is kind of a Christian apologist, but he has a whole book called Defending Life, a Moral Legal Case Against Abortion Choice. There's Scott Klusendorf, who has a really good book on this. And then if you want a more kind of moral philosopher, I guess Christopher Caxor would be one. He has a book called The Ethics of Abortion, which I really like, by the way. It's a long treatise on the ethics of this issue, and it's very, very well argues for the pro-life side. He tackles a lot of the big philosophers, pro-choice philosophers like Peter Singer and David Boone, which Beckwith does too. But Beckwith, his book is kind of a mix between the legal aspect and the ethical aspect, whereas Caxor's book is purely just the moral side of the issue. So yeah, and then there's also there's Don Marquis's article that he wrote, which I really didn't his Why Abortion is Immoral, where he gives the future like ours argument, which I didn't really hear about until much later. Like I'd say a lot more recently, but it's mostly people like Beckwith, Caxor, and Scott Klusendorf that I kind of modeled myself after. So
Considering that in the United States political scene, and even up here in Canada, that the Christian community has been the one who has been pushing the pro-life side, and yet it seems to be more or less absent from atheist circles, even though there are people who are atheists who might not agree with the pro-choice position. What do you make of people who try to argue the pro-life position sans a Christian foundation?
you mean like giving an argument like the Bible says abortion is wrong or something like that, or
Just people who are atheists but would not agree with the Christian church on biblical based arguments or maybe even theistic based arguments about the immorality of abortion, but who would argue for more of a secular viewpoint on the matter. Do you think that their position is just as valid, or do you think it has some feature which is lacking that the Christian worldview might have?
I think it's valid to argue from a non-Christian point of view, right, for the pro-choice position, because I've always stated you don't need to. I mean, you can, but you don't need to use the Bible or Christianity to argue for the pro-life position. I mean, unless, of course, granted, now when you push hard enough and get down to what's sometimes called the metaphysical basement, like if you really get down to the ultimate question, though, of why, well, why does, at the end of the day, why does anybody have any value or right to life at all. Well, at that point, I'm going to say, well, if you push hard enough, I will say it is ultimately because God made us in His image, though. But that's only where I'll go if you get down to that level. But I mean, if you just assume sort of an atheist framework, well, human beings are valuable just because, and build on top of that. Like I still think you can run the same kind of arguments because I mean,
So, from what I gather of your answer, it just is a summation of, while atheists can indeed make pro-life arguments, which are in themselves valid, it's only when you get to a much deeper meta-ethical question of why is there morality at all, or what makes something morally true, then the atheist has a problem. I
yes,
think that's the summation. Okay, that's a
yeah,
fair answer.
yeah.
So, okay, so off to my next question, which is, as somebody who is a male, usually the argument given by many on the pro-choice side of things is that you might have a certain bias or not understanding that a woman might, who actually would be the one who is going through and giving birth with a child. How would you respond to arguments that are more or less seeking to criticize your position as a male in this debate?
Well, I mean, partly my response does sometimes depend on how the question is asked, if you know what
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying. 'Cause people I find bring it up in different tones because sometimes people, will bring it up in that tone of, well, you're a man, you have no, you can't talk about this issue at all. Or then there's the people who are saying, well, don't you think the fact that you can't get pregnant means that it's not appropriate for you to talk about it. So it depends on how they ask the question, but the general answer in any case is usually the idea that, well, we still have to focus on the arguments. I mean, arguments don't have genitals, right? So at the end of the day, you still have to answer the arguments. So yes, I am a man. I can't get pregnant, obviously, so I'll never experience what that's like. But nevertheless, I don't think that's a good reason to discount what I have to say about the issue. I mean, so that's the general way I respond to it. So, and then I may, I don't know, give illustrations or something to go on top of that, depending on where I am in the conversation with the person. So.
All right, that's fair enough. Now, on to kind of the first line of argument. There are a lot of people who do seem to empathize with the pro life position, but would not go ahead and wish for abortion to be something which is illegal. Because if abortion were to be illegal, then the effects would be much worse than if it was just legalized and then just reduced in some other way, like through social welfare programs. Now, with that kind of response, doesn't it kind of get into less about morality and the ethics of doing the action, and more or less about the application in terms of our own laws? So how would
Well,
you? So would you think that? Would you respond by saying that the legal aspect and the moral aspect are just intertwined, or would you more or less respond by saying um, we wouldn't actually experience those consequences if abortion were to be illegalized?
well, the thing is, I don't think you can entirely separate the legal aspect from the moral aspect,
Mhm.
right? Any more than I don't think you can entirely separate the moral and legal aspect of issues like slavery or segregation laws in this country. Like, so to answer the question about um, uh, what lost my train of thought there. Oh yeah, so the question about like so people who are, as you say, empathize with the pro-life position, but still think that we shouldn't make it illegal here. Usually, when people say something like that, I always think the best thing to ask them first is, well, why do they empathize with it, or why do they not like abortion, or depending on what they say, because if the answer is, well, because it kills a baby and killing babies are wrong here, then it just always seems to me kind of commonsensical at that point. Well, then don't you think it should be illegal? I mean, because we don't say the same, we don't use that kind of reasoning when it comes to newborns, like when it comes to infanticide or something. I can't imagine anybody ever saying like, well, I sympathize. I think it I think it should. I agree that it's wrong to commit infanticide because it kills babies, but I'm just not sure about it being illegal here. Like nobody would take that seriously because of the horrendous moral crime of killing a newborn infant, though. And so it seems that if the pro-life position is correct in that the fetus is a human person with the same rights as the rest of us here, then I don't see any reason to make it to make it to keep it legal, right?
Mhm.
So
So another kind of criticism, mostly from the political aspect, is the people who tend to favor the pro-life side are also more fiscally conservative, which would mean that there would be less social benefits given to single mothers, families who have a lot of children already. What would be your response there? Or do you think that this is just outside of the scope, and what anyone's opinion on this is in terms of a political issue regarding welfare is completely secondary to this? Because one could technically be, as I am, somebody who favors social welfare, and at the same time, somebody who is against abortion.
well, I mean, I guess in one sense, I mean, oh, well, sure, certainly it's an important issue, right, to
Hmm.
figure out. Well, what about single mothers? I mean, what do we do with these people who are trying to raise a child who maybe don't have the financial means? That's certainly an important question here, but I feel like the real debate is still going to be like, you know, what you know so sometimes it's put to me like, well, what do you sometimes okay, so when I dialogue with students sometimes on college campuses, sometimes people will say that to me, like, well, what do you plan on doing with all these unwanted born children here? What's your solution to that problem here? And oftentimes I'll say something like, well, I may not know the best solution to that problem, but I know what the solution is not. And the solution is not abortion, because it unjustly kills an innocent human being, right?
Hmm.
So while it is an important question to figure out what are we going to do, what's the solution to this, I think it's important to emphasize, though, that the solution is not abortion because it kills an innocent human being. And I say that because oftentimes, in the context is usually brought up, pro-choicers will say, well, because of all this, blah, 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 isn't it better to isn't abortion a better option here? And that's what I'm trying to argue against here. So I guess you could say I'm kind of open-ended on what the solution is. So,
Okay, cool. Now that the more legal stuff is out of the way, let's get to the more metaphysical and metaethical questions. So, metaphysical just refers to what the ultimate nature of a fetus is. Is it human, or is it um, not a human? And metaethical just means what is our moral obligation to it. So some people on the pro-choice side will make the claim that, and grant you, that it is in fact an unborn child. It is in fact human. Yet at the same time, our obligations always waver to the autonomy of the mother and not to the rights of the fetus, because human rights do not go or expand to the point of violating another person's autonomy. A thought experiment usually used to illustrate this is Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist thought experiment, which is, imagine if you were abducted by fans of this very impressive violinist, and they put you right next to him, and you're just giving him blood as they keep him alive. And while this is all going on, your autonomy is violated. It's not the violinist who's doing it. The violinist isn't aware of any of this going on. He's put under anesthetic. It's and at the same time, you're just by his bedside keeping him alive. Wouldn't anyone in that position say, "Yeah, you have a right to completely detach yourself from the violinist there"? And that's because even though the violinist, might have a right to life in any other respects, because of the uniqueness of this scenario, you yourself have a right to autonomy which cannot be violated by his right to life. So if you disconnected, even if it resulted in his death, it would be completely fair. How would you respond to such a point like that?
I love talking about this argument. It's so fascinating to me. Ever since I first heard it. So, okay, so this is this particular type of, because I find, first of all, there's multiple kinds of bodily autonomy type objections one could give, but this is definitely the most sophisticated version of it.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a lot of objections one can that and that have been raised in the literature. Actually, one objection I often like to go to is what's often called the responsibility objection, which is the idea that, okay, because the woman is responsible for the child being in this needy position here via engaging in consensual sex, which is an act that we know produces needy children. When I say needy, by the way, I just mean the fact that the fetus, at least in the earliest parts of pregnancy, needs the woman's body to survive. So that's just what I mean when I say that. It is in a position of needing her to live. So because she's responsible for that, she has an obligation to continue the pregnancy. And one way I like to illustrate this is sort of by modifying the original violinist analogy in a sort of reverse violinist analogy, if you will, which I think this came from oh, what's his name? I don't remember his name. I feel embarrassed about that, but whatever.
Don't worry. What you can do is just later on look up his name, and by the time that I would upload this, I'll put it in the description bar.
Okay. Okay, cool. Anyway, so the way it does is this. So imagine, you wake up, you're surgically connected to this unconscious patient next to you, and then the hospital director comes in and says that actually you were kidnapped by the Society of Musical Pranksters, of which this person sitting next to you is a part of, and they'd like to just kidnap people while they're asleep and plug themselves in because they just get a kick out of it, right? It's so much fun. Unfortunately, however, every once in a while, it gives the people they plug into this kidney condition, like the one that the violinist has in Thompson's original thought experiment. So now you have this kidney condition here. Now you got to stay plugged into this prankster for the next 9 months here. So suppose the prankster, upon waking up, uses the logic that Thompson and others would have us believe and say, well, I don't have the right. You don't have the right. It's my body. I don't have the right to keep you alive for the next 9 months. And he unplugs from you, and then you die of kidney failure here. Now, I think a lot of us would say that, well, no, he should have stayed plugged into you. Well, why is that? Well, because he's responsible for you being in that situation in the first place. And so, in the same way, because a pregnant woman in that like 99% of cases is responsible for the fetus being in that needy position, she does not have the right to just unplug or terminate the pregnancy, whichever phrase you want to use, so to speak. So that'd be the gist. That's the big objection that I like often to bring to the argument. So.
That's pretty interesting. So there has been one kind of interesting way to respond to that, and it was actually by a YouTube user and philosopher within his own right, Sisyphus Redeemed, who is Gary
Yeah.
Merriam in real life, and he brings up the objection of, okay, imagine this. Imagine if you know of a scenario where there are musical kidnappers near the opera, and you just decide to go to the opera, despite the fact that you have a good, higher than normal possibility where they can indeed abduct you. In that case, even though you knew about the situation but went anyway, wouldn't you be blaming the victim if you could decide to say, well, they should stay to the violinist because by going to the opera house, they knew that there would be a chance of reproduction?
Yeah, Sisyphus Redeemed. I know him actually. I've talked with him quite a bit about this argument actually.
Cool.
Okay, so first of all, that particular point he brings up it isn't really in response so much to the reverse violinist. It's just the basic idea of the responsibility objection. But
Mhm.
nevertheless, I think that the way would articulate is for one thing. Okay, again, it doesn't directly address the way I've alternated the scenario, because I would argue, first of all, that the reverse violinist scenario that I was giving a moment ago is closer to engaging in an act that puts someone in this position than,
Mhm.
say, walking into a building where you might get kidnapped by via the Society of Musical Lovers or whatnot. So the basic point being that I would argue that sex is more oriented toward pregnancy in a way that just, I don't know, walking into a building where you might get kidnapped is not, if that makes any sense, right? So
Right.
um I guess I could elaborate on that further if that's not clear enough, but
So I think the basic gist is the reverse violinist argument is more analogous than uh, Professor Merriam's analogy is, because under your specific scenario, usually there are far more likely to be cases in terms of, people, amateurs, just hooking people up and there comes a kidney failure, than, let's say, um, the Society of Musical Lovers uh, kidnapping you when you walk into a building. Something
Yeah,
akin to that?
yeah, you could say that. So yeah, the basic gist being, I would argue that my scenario, well, okay, it's not really mine, but the reverse violinist scenario is more analogous to pregnancy than what Garrett is trying, or yeah, I always call him by his first name, what Mr. Miriam is trying to give in his sort of reply to that. So.
Interesting. All right. And do you have any other responses to the violinist? Because you said that was your
Oh
favorite
well,
one.
yeah. There are others. Like one example is often, I mean, which I admit this next objection is very limited in its use, but nevertheless, I still think there is a use for it. Though it's often called the killing versus let die objection, which is like this. So, in the original in Thompson's violinist scenario, right, all you're doing is unplugging. You're just detaching yourself basically from the violin player. But in the vast majority of abortion cases, right, it's more than just detaching or just unplugging, like it's actively killing, like surgical dismembering or burning
Mhm.
or whatever. And so oftentimes, if you say to someone, so like, because imagine if in Thompson's violinist scenario, instead of just unplugging, you realize to get yourself, you'd have to like start hacking the violinist into pieces to get yourself away from him, which, yeah, it's a very gruesome image, granted. But so I think even Jeff McMahon, I believe it was, I think it was him at least, he said that he does find that idea very uncomfortable and disturbing to think about here. But it seems if you really want to get analogous, though, you'd have to say that that's permissible. And I find that a lot of people, when they hear that, just kind of go, well, I'm not sure about that. Now, I say it's limited because oftentimes the first response pro-choicers give then is they'll say like, well then okay, but then what if we just did a pregnancy in such a way that we just induced labor, right, and just let the just where the fetus came out, we didn't touch it or anything, and just let the fetus die after it came out. So admittedly, it wouldn't apply to situations like that, but it would still follow though that the vast majority of abortions are still immoral because they still use this method of actively killing instead of just letting die. So.
Also, theoretically, because technology is becoming far more sophisticated, as soon as the fetus is disattached from the woman's body, we would actually at that point have no excuse for not hooking that fetus up to the best technology available and
Right.
keeping it alive.
Right. That's interesting that you bring that up because I think that brings up an interesting point that I think Thompson's violinist argument, even if we grant it, right, it only works up till the point of viability, right?
Right.
Even David Boonin makes this point in his book, A Defense of Abortion, because he notes how if we look at some of these situations through the lens of this argument, it solves certain puzzles, right? So, like, okay, so imagine that, like, so you have to be plugged into Thompson's violinist for 9 months. But suppose, say, maybe it's 7 months. You could unplug from him, and there'd be a reasonably good chance that he would survive, right? But then
Right.
suppose but suppose right at 7 months, you just I just you just shoot the violinist in the head, right? It's like, well, wait a minute, no, you might have a right to unplug from him, but you don't have the right to just kill him like that. He could live on his own, right? Or he could
Right.
live on his own. See, so.
Right.
But isn't it fun, the kind of thought experiments you get into in wacky philosophy land, right? But
Right.
but point being though that I think even if we grant the argument, it only works till the point of viability though. So.
hmm This is all right. Cool. This is pretty interesting. So another kind of argument that's often used is that we do not, in fact, value the life of the unborn as much as we value the life of an actual person, and this can be proven through various thought experiments. One of the more interesting ones is, imagine that there's some kind of killer robot, um, and you're walking by, and this killer robot's either going to kill off 5 fetuses or one 5-year-old child. Now, for most people, our intuitions is save the 5-year-old child from the killer robot, as opposed to the 5 fetuses. This is kind of the intuition we all have here. But at the same time, um, this kind of seems to backfire on us if we decide to save the 5-year-old, because it just goes to prove all along we never believed that the fetuses, or heck, the zygotes, or you could even take it down further to the viable sperm in the egg. Um, to that level, we never assumed that any of those had the same value as a living, breathing child. How would you respond to that kind of thought experiment?
Okay, first of all, if the thought experiment is being used, as I sometimes hear it used, to say that, well, you don't really believe, right, that
Right.
the unborn are valuable the way born people are. Sometimes I feel like, okay, so just because someone may choose to save the toddler or newborn or whatever it was, I assume it was a born human being, right? That was the one people choose to save. Doesn't necessarily mean I don't value it, because sometimes people's emotions can cloud their thinking, right? So, for example, right, like suppose it was like suppose it was a choice between my wife, assuming I had one at least, and 5 random strangers, right? I would probably save the wife, but that doesn't mean I think that therefore the 5 strangers are just undifferentiated, valueless blobs of tissue, right?
Mhm.
So just the point is, just because I would do a situation, just because I might or someone else might choose to save the one person versus the other 5 doesn't mean they don't value the other 5. In fact, the way to look at it is, why is there even a dilemma in the first place? Well, because everybody's valuable. Otherwise, there'd be no dilemma in the first place here.
Mhm.
Um, Second thing here is that I think, and this is one of those cases where I would just argue that, well, I mean, our intuitions can probably be a bit maybe misleading, if I'd want to put it that way, because I mean, the thing is, like, so if all my arguments are correct, right, that the fetus is a valuable human being and everything, then it's just a logical entailment that, yes, I mean, the 5 fetuses in this scenario would be just as valuable as the newborn infant. So I
Mhm.
mean,
Would you?
unless you're already committed to the idea that they're not as valuable, then of course it's gonna be easy. Like, yeah, of course let's save the newborn. So.
Mhm. All right. So my question to you is, if you are in that scenario, would you? And there was a kind of burning building, and you could either get alive one toddler or 5 fetuses um, that are preserved. Which would you choose yourself?
Now, are we also just so we're clear, we're assuming the fetuses are gonna actually survive once I save them, right?
They will, if they all survive, I
Mhm.
will guarantee you that they will all go to a mother who will uh, who will give birth to them up until the point of conception, whereas at that point it's just free game.
Yeah, well, I'd like to think that I would save the fetuses, given my
Oh,
view and everything. So, yeah.
okay.
I mean, I
Um,
feel it'd be a consistent thing to do. I mean, granted, unless of course the newborn was maybe my child or something. I mean, then my emotions. I mean, I would probably just choose my kid, maybe in the heat of the moment, sort of thing. But assuming that all of them are just strangers, I think I just choose the fetuses. So.
Technically, I would also point out that one could even choose the toddler in such a scenario, and you still wouldn't have a too huge a backfiring. Imagine a scenario where you could either save a 5-year-old toddler, or you can, I don't know how, but you could engineer a way of saving 5 elderly people who are in their late 70s and all in a very comatose state. We pretty much people would go for the toddler in this case, thinking, well, yes, the elderly all have a right to life, but at the same time, this is just a kid who's coming into the world, has a chance. Everyone here has already experienced a good life. Let's go with the toddler, because it doesn't mean that the elderly are not valuable as human beings. It's just that in such a scenario, we can make a case of rescuing the toddler, who probably at this point already has a mother, a huger community who cares about him than the unborn.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting way to look at it here. Now, I think what some of these variations here show is that the thought experiment to begin with isn't quite as cut and dry as it may first appear, right?
Right.
Because as it's originally presented, you find out it's a bit too simplistic, if that's, yeah, for lack of a better word, right? So, because when you start altering certain things, you begin to find, well, maybe there are scenarios where it could be appropriate to save one over the other 5 or whatever. But yeah, the point being that I don't think it really shows very well at the end of the day that the 5 fetuses or whatever are less valuable than the newborn or toddler. So.
All right, cool. So the next point would be um, probably the more radical conception where the unborn is not even a human person at this point. If somebody is going to make such a claim, how would you respond to that one? Someone who isn't at all convinced that that is even when life begins. Life starts as soon as the thing can live on its own, as
Okay,
soon as it has viability.
Okay. So, okay, well, yeah, like I was gonna say, yeah, it's good, interesting you mentioned viability because I was about to ask. Well, I say the first thing I would do is ask questions here because
Mhm.
there are so many different pro-choicers have so many different views on this about when it becomes a person. You know, some say it's like when you get a brain. Some say it's when you get organized cortical brain activity between 20-25 weeks. Some say it's when you get a nervous system. Some say it's not till 2 months after birth or something. So it how I respond does depend indeed on the criterion they're using. But you mentioned specifically viability, so do you want to address that
Let
first?
let's start going with viability
Okay.
because this is the closest to birth. And how about we just work our way back to the other answers that you would probably get?
Okay, sure. So the idea being that okay, so it doesn't become a person or something until viability. Well, for one thing, viability has the line in which it becomes viable has changed throughout the years. I think when Roe v. Wade was passed back in '73, I think the viability line back then was around, was it like, I want to say 27, 28, 29 weeks, something around that area. But now, because of our technology has gotten better, we've gotten better incubators and stuff like that. It's been the viability line has been pushed back even further now. So the bizarre implication this has is that see, you notice that nothing about the fetus really changes. It's just our technology that's changing here, right?
Right.
So that would mean that so back in the '70s, a 28-week-old fetus, okay, according to this criterion, okay, it's valuable. You're a person with rights. We can't kill you and everything. But then oh, I'm sorry, I should come back. Like a 24-week-old, a 25-week-old fetus, right? Valuable. We can kill you. You're not. Abortion is permissible back at that point, 25 weeks. But then nowadays, because with better technology, okay, now when he's at that point, we can't because now it's a person. But what about the fetus has changed? Nothing. It's just our technology that's changed. So for
Right.
that's the main reason I don't think it's a very good kind of criterion to begin with. So.
So it's because the no, it would kind of push the notion of life as being something extrinsic, something we place on an object, as opposed to what the thing is in and of itself.
Exactly, yeah. Which I
Right.
think, is what leads to all these really bizarre types of scenarios like that. Of well, yeah, okay, it's just our technology that's changing, not the fetus. So,
Okay. So another one you mentioned is when it produces a nervous system. How do you respond to someone giving that kind of claim?
well, the thing about a nervous system though is, well, I mean, okay, if you say because this varies here, because a fetus gets a nervous system, at least it starts to get one very early on here. So, because what's the week? I think it's like within the first few weeks or something of pregnancy. Around it's actually because by the time that most abortions take place, which is like what 7, 8, 9 weeks, it technically has a nervous system. It's very underdeveloped, uh, but it technically has one. So by that definition, by the way, the vast majority of abortions would still be immoral under that view. I mean, granted, it wouldn't apply to embryonic stem cell research or using the morning after pill, though. So it's for that reason, though, that I always find it interesting the very few times I hear somebody try to say that. Now, one way they could try to switch it up and say, well, it has to have a fully developed nervous system, right? Well, but technically the nervous system isn't even fully developed at birth. It's still developing throughout a lot of your life. So if that's the argument, you would justify killing children because they don't have a fully developed nervous system. So that's one way I like to respond to that. And then also that I usually just ask, well, why does having a nervous system even make you valuable in the first place, right? I mean,
Hmm.
for instance, we can easily imagine what is it, like non-human beings, right, that don't have nervous systems yet are valuable, right? Like I don't know, like fictional creatures like angels or something like that. Now, maybe the person's an atheist or something; they don't believe in beings like that. But nevertheless, like non-physical.
Maybe it could be like one of those plasma aliens from Futurama.
I actually have not seen Futurama.
Oh, there
I
are
should
aliens that are there are aliens that have eyes, nose, mouths, completely made up of some ectoplasm or maybe some kind of space goop. Yet we kind of
Yeah,
have an emotional draw to such characters.
yeah, right. Yeah, sure. We could easily. It's easy to conceive of beings like this that nevertheless are clearly persons that have value, but yet don't have a nervous system. And if those are even possible, then it shows that it's not having a nervous system that makes one valuable. So that would be how I usually respond to someone who brings that point up.
Hmm. Although I assume kind of a point would be, well, those are just fictional characters. We can't let our imaginations draw on what's happening in the real world.
Yeah,
Um,
but that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
uh, no, I'm done.
Oh, okay. Okay. I feel like that kind of misses the point here. Like, yes, it's imaginary, though, right? But I mean, because if you're going to dismiss a scenario because it's imaginative, then you have to pretty much dismiss all philosophical thought experiments, though. But the point of a thought experiment is how we can derive certain basic principles that are obvious, that may be self-evident or obvious to us. And yes, while the scenario or the beings in question were imagined or fictional, right? The the intuition we get from that is still real, right? We still recognize that, well, yeah, if beings like that did exist, they would clearly be persons.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, because we accept that as we reflect on that, we're therefore committed on pain of inconsistency to the conclusion that, okay, well, then it must not be a nervous system then that makes us valuable, unless you're going to say that, well, no, even beings like that, they wouldn't be persons, which seems crazy. So, but saying, well, it's just imaginary just misses the point, right? I mean, Superman is imaginary. He's not real, but yet if he did exist, he would clearly be a person. And it just seems weird to just, at best, to dismiss that. Well, because he's just not real. You can't get anything from that, even though I think you clearly can. So.
Okay. Cool. So let's see. We already covered that. We covered the nerve. We covered earlier viability. How about, for example, when blood starts flowing through the fetus? Because I have actually heard even Christians argue that um, the life is usually determined by having blood, because in the Bible, spilling blood occurs as being kind of the greatest penalty. But non biblical people or non Christians can easily make kind of the same point. Well, there's no real blood to spill here. I mean, we wouldn't consider persons having uh, not having blood to be worthy, or would you just go over the same kind of argument you would use for the nervous system?
Somewhat different though. The main point I would make though, you know, I guess this would apply to both Christians and non-Christians though, is that blood, right? Okay, so at this stage, because remember, right, an embryo, a fetus, right? It's just a biological human organism in an earlier stage of development, right? Just like
Right.
a baby, toddler. So now, at our stage of development, like someone like you or me, like you and I, like we need blood to survive. Like if someone drained all the blood from my body, like I would die right now because I need that to survive. But an embryo or a fetus in its earliest stages doesn't need blood in order to live. So in other words, the reason people may place important emphasis on blood is just because, well, at our stage of development, we need blood to survive, but an embryo doesn't need blood, so that's why it's not as important for an embryo. So, but I don't see, but now saying so, I don't see how it follows from that to say, well, therefore, blood. If you don't have blood, you're not a person. Like I'm not sure at all how that would follow. So.
What about maybe the Christian pro-choicer making that kind of argument?
I would say something very similar, right? And that the reason that, because like when they say the blood of, well, I guess maybe I'd have to ask what specific part of the Bible are they talking about. But from what you are saying, I mean, from what you just said, I would say the general thing remains the same. But yes, in later stages of development, like it could be called that because at that stage you need blood to survive. So but I don't see even, I mean, unless there's some more explicit passage that they're referring to that says, well, no, because an embryo or a child in the womb or whatever term you want to use doesn't have blood, it's not valuable, then I don't, again, I think it would just, it falls prey to the same objection.
Oh, okay. Um, Now, how about what you yourself would consider to be a human person? Um, what stage would you say such a being becomes human, and for what reason? I assume for you it's conception.
Yes, actually. So so I would round like you call personhood in like the fact that we're all biologically human, right? I've often rather liked, I believe this definition comes from Boethius, who called a person what he called an individual substance with a rational nature. So the idea being that I think that being human is sufficient to be a person, but not a necessary condition here. So like, for example, like okay, so the fact that we're rational animals is what makes us valuable. Now, here's the point to be made, because sometimes pro-choicers will jump on this and say, "Ah, see, right?" But then an embryo isn't rational at all. It can't think or can't reason or or have moral judgments, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing we have to distinguish is there's a difference between functioning as a rational animal and versus being a rational animal. I remember Christopher Caxor gave an analogy in his book, The Ethics of Abortion. He like considered genitals, right? They're reproductive organs, right? Their purpose is to, reproduce, etc. And or at least that's one of its functions here. And they're still genitals, even if they're not actually performing the act of reproduction, right? And they may also merit certain respect, like, touching someone's genitals may be inappropriate in a way that, say, touching someone on the shoulder is not. Now, it would be very weird, to say the least, if someone said, well, they're not really reproductive organs unless they're functioning as such, but they clearly are. So, in the same way, we humans are rational animals, even if we aren't functioning as such. And this intuition, I think this best explains why, say someone who's in a temporary coma, right, where they're not sentient or not functioning rationally, is still a valuable person because of the kind of thing they are, not what they can currently do. So that makes sense.
Okay, so the point is, as far as I can draw, we are persons if and only if we have some kind of developmental potency to develop rational faculties or functions that work towards rationality. And
Something like that.
because at conception, what happens is, since we're developing that continuously with the spreading of the cells up until the point of development and to the point where we become independent, viable beings, at that point we are all to be considered human.
Yeah. So yeah, like the idea that, yeah, once conception happens and you have a human organism, and if humans are inherently a rational animal, and with that comes our value and why it's wrong to take a life of a human because we're valuable, then yes, so it follows that from conception you are a valuable human being because it's essentially who you are, even if you can't function currently as such. So yeah, that's the basic gist. So
Okay, so it would be very different from like an individual sperm or egg who on their own do not have any potential to develop these things. We're
right,
not
right.
right,
Just
barring any kind of supernatural intervention. That is.
Well, yeah, because a sperm and an egg. Okay, so a sperm and an egg are. Because I often hear the objection sometimes. Well, what about a sperm and an egg? So if you like scratch your hand or whatever, you committing genocide because of all the skin cells you're killing or something like that, or um, so the idea is that it confuses parts with wholes, right? So, like I say, sperm and egg are parts of another organism, right? The same way that skin cells, right, or fingers or something like that are parts of me, another organism. Whereas an embryo is a separate and distinct organism from the mother here, right? Because the sperm and the egg, they don't survive conception, right? They basically break down and form a whole new organism, though. So, no, so sperm and egg would not be the same, would not be an individual organism the way an embryo would be. So,
All right, cool. And let's see if I can pull one more question out of here. what do you think is the best way for kind of the pro-life movement to proceed? Because usually one kind of criticism that is made of the movement is that it's very exclusive to people who might be, let's just say, LGBT, people who are women, people who are essentially they. I've heard the claim that it's just a movement by old white men to control women's bodies and that kind of thing. Do you think those kind of characterizations are unfair, or do you think that there might be some truth in it, where maybe it is exclusionary to some people?
Well, admittedly, this is a more sociological question, but nevertheless, I think for the most, in my experience, I feel like for the most part, at least, claims like that are very unfounded. I found the pro-life movement is very diverse, frankly. Like, there's like there's I know plenty of women who are pro-life. I know gay people who are pro-life, and then there's even and even atheists who are pro-life. There's even that website Secular Pro-Life. Uh, so I mean. I guess maybe I mean I'm speculating somewhat here. I guess maybe it's propagated by the fact that a lot of the politicians, the pro-life politicians you often see in the news are usually white men and everything, and maybe that's where that comes from, I guess. But I feel like if you really get out and start talking to people and really, sort of really getting, again, just talking to people in the pro-life movement, I think you'll find that it's actually a lot more diverse than some people would have us believe. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. So I
Um,
think, go ahead.
So, was that all the question? Because wasn't there something earlier where you said, where do we go? What should we do, or something, or was that just it? Like,
Oh, I said I wasn't sure where to go from here. But I
oh,
think that's a pretty good question to end off on. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciated your answers. You did quite well.
thank you.
All right, and everyone, thank you for joining us. This has been Maximus Confesses here. Please do not forget to subscribe, share, and push this channel forward with anything you have. Thank you for joining.